Story 1. Deep in the heart of Blackwood Forest, a forgotten cabin sat nestled among the towering trees. It was an old structure, abandoned long ago, its wooden frame creaking under the weight of countless winters. Yet the locals whispered of strange happenings, lights flickering in its windows at night, faint laughter echoing in the wind, and shadows that didn't belong to the trees. Celia wasn't one for ghost stories. She had always dismissed them as overactive imaginations, but when her friends dared her to spend a night alone in the cabin, she found herself agreeing. She packed a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and some snacks, determined to prove them wrong. The hike to the cabin was uneventful, the air crisp and the forest alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and chirping birds. But as Celia approached the clearing, a strange silence fell over the woods. It was as if the trees were holding their breath, watching her every step. The cabin loomed before her, its windows dark and lifeless. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, revealing a single room filled with dust and cobwebs. A stone fireplace sat cold and empty, and a rickety table stood in one corner. Celia set up her sleeping bag near the center of the room and lit a small lantern to chase away the shadows. As the hours passed, the forest outside seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier. Celia tried to distract herself by reading a book, but her thoughts kept drifting to the strange stillness. Then, just as she was beginning to relax, she heard a faint whisper, soft and barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. Her heart raced as she turned her head, the light from the lantern casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then it came again, closer this time, as if someone was standing right behind her. "Leave. Leave." Celia spun around, her flashlight sweeping across the empty cabin. There was no one there, yet the voice had been unmistakable. She tried to convince herself it was the wind, but deep down she knew better. The whispers grew louder as the night went on, joined by soft laughter and the sound of footsteps pacing across the wooden floor. Celia clutched her flashlight, her breathing ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to leave, but the thought of stepping into the pitch-black forest was even more terrifying. As the clock struck midnight, the lantern flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. Celia fumbled with her flashlight, her hands shaking, but the beam of light only seemed to intensify the shadows. And then she saw a figure standing in the corner, its face hidden in the gloom. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, its presence suffocating. Celia's grip on the flashlight tightened as she slowly backed away, her eyes never leaving the shadowy form. But as she reached the door, she realized with horror that it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew deafening, surrounding her, filling her mind. "Leave. Leave. Leave." Celia screamed, her voice echoing in the empty cabin. And then, everything went silent. When the townsfolk found the cabin the next morning, it was empty. Celia was gone, her belongings scattered across the floor. But the whispers remained, louder than ever, calling out to anyone who dared to enter. The whispers settled momentarily after Celia's scream. The silence that followed was deafening, and the cabin seemed to exhale with a low groan, as if it had been holding its breath. Celia pressed her back against the stubborn door, her flashlight trembling in her hands, the thin beam of light flickering wildly across the decaying walls. The shadow in the corner had vanished. The absence of the figure brought her no comfort. It was as though it had melted into the very fabric of the room, weaving itself into the dark spaces where the lantern's light could no longer reach. Celia's breaths came in shallow, ragged bursts, each one clouding in the frigid air. She had no idea how the temperature had dropped so quickly, but her skin prickled with the frost now coating the cabin's windows. The whispers returned. But this time they weren't just in the corner. They were everywhere, circling her, closing in, pressing against her skull. "Leave. Leave. Stay. Stay. Don't turn around. Don't look away." The conflicting voices overlapped, growing more frantic, more desperate. Celia clamped her hands over her ears, but it was useless. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside her head, coiling around her thoughts like vines. "No," she shouted, trying to drown them out. The sound of her voice broke the spell, and for a brief moment, the cabin fell silent once more. But that silence was quickly replaced by a new sound of faint scratching, coming from behind her. Celia turned slowly, her flashlight aimed at the door. Her breath hitched as she saw long, jagged claw marks etching themselves into the wood. The scratches came in rhythmic strokes, deliberate and unrelenting, as if some unseen hand was carving a message. "Leave." The letters formed one by one, each stroke accompanied by a sickening scraping sound. Celia's mind raced as she stumbled backward, her flashlight falling from her trembling hand and clattering to the floor. Okay, she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll go. I'll leave." But as she turned to face the room, her heart dropped. The figure had returned, now standing in the center of the cabin. Its form was clearer now, illuminated by the pale moonlight streaming through the cracked windows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body shrouded in tattered, shadowy fabric that seemed to move and ripple like smoke. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, an empty, gaping nothingness that seemed to pull at her, drawing her in. Celia wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen, rooted to the spot as the figure raised a skeletal hand and pointed at her. "Leave," it said, its voice a guttural growl that echoed in the deepest corners of her mind. "I'm trying," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. The figure tilted its head, as if studying her. Then, with a sudden violent motion, it lunged forward. Celia screamed and dove to the side, her flashlight skittering across the floor. She scrambled to her feet, her hands searching frantically for the door handle. The figure loomed closer, its movements unnaturally jerky, as if it were a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Finally, the door gave way, bursting open with a gust of icy wind. Celia stumbled out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. She ran blindly into the forest, her lungs burning, her legs trembling beneath her. The whispers followed her, weaving through the trees, growing louder with every step. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel that the figure was chasing her, its presence pressing against her back like a physical weight. "Leave. Leave. Leave." The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around her, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. Celia's vision blurred with tears, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She tripped over a root and fell hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. For a moment she lay there, unable to move. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison. She braced herself, waiting for the figure to claim her. But then, everything stopped. The forest fell silent. The air grew still. Celia opened her eyes and found herself alone, the cabin and the figure nowhere in sight. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. She sat up slowly, her body aching, her mind reeling. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare? But as she looked down, her heart skipped a beat. Her hands were covered in dirt and blood, and etched into the ground before her were the same jagged letters. "Believe." Celia stared at the letters etched into the dirt, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The blood on her hands wasn't hers, but whose could it have been? Her mind reeled with questions she couldn't answer. The whispers were gone, the forest eerily silent, but the weight of the night still hung heavy in the air. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. Every step she took was hesitant, as though the ground itself might shift or the trees might come alive. She wiped her hands on her jeans, smearing the blood but failing to rid herself of the sensation. The only thought anchoring her now was to keep moving, to get as far away from the cursed cabin as possible. As she trudged through the dense forest, the darkness seemed to press in closer, swallowing the weak light of the moon. The cold was biting, seeping into her bones, but Celia barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed by the figure, the whispers, and the unrelenting message, leave. But leave to where? The forest was endless, its maze like paths unfamiliar and disorienting. She had no sense of direction, no idea if she was even heading back toward her car. The further she walked, the more the trees seemed to twist and warp, their branches resembling skeletal fingers reaching toward her. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The oppressive silence of the forest was broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. Celia's throat was dry, her body aching from exhaustion, but she didn't dare stop. Then, in the distance, she saw a faint, flickering light. Her heart leapt. Maybe it was another cabin or a campsite. Someone who could help her. She quickened her pace, stumbling over roots and rocks as she hurried toward the light. As she drew closer, she realized it wasn't a fire or a lantern. It was an old street lamp, its bulb flickering weakly. The sight was bizarre. There was no road, no path, just the lone lamp standing in the middle of the forest. Celia hesitated, unease prickling at her skin. But she couldn't afford to be picky. Any sign of civilization was better than nothing. She stepped into the circle of light, its glow casting eerie shadows on the ground. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope. But that hope was short-lived. The whispers returned. They started softly, barely audible over the sound of her breathing. Then they grew louder, more insistent, circling her like a swarm of invisible insects. Celia. Her name. They were saying her name now. Stay. Run. Come back. Her chest tightened, panic rising like a tide. She spun around, searching for the source of the voices, but there was nothing, just darkness beyond the reach of the street lamp. And then she saw it. The figure. Ballet. It was standing just beyond the light, its tall, shadowy form blending seamlessly with the trees. But it wasn't alone. Behind it were others, more figures, all shrouded in the same smoky darkness, their void-like faces turned toward her. Celia backed away, her hands trembling. "Stay away," she screamed, her voice cracking. The figures didn't move. They simply stood there, watching her, their presence suffocating. One of them raised a hand and pointed to the ground. Celia followed its gesture, her eyes widening in horror. The dirt beneath her feet had transformed, the letters carved into it glowing faintly in the light. "We'll leave." No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not staying. I'm leaving. I'm leaving." She turned and ran, her legs burning with the effort. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic with every step. The figures didn't chase her, but their presence lingered, as if they were watching her from every shadow. Finally, she burst out of the forest and onto a dirt road. Relief flooded her as she recognized the familiar path leading back to her car. She ran faster, the sight of her vehicle in the distance giving her a renewed burst of energy. When she reached the car, she yanked the door open and scrambled inside, locking the doors behind her. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, but eventually the engine roared to life. Celia didn't look back as she sped down the road, the forest disappearing in her rearview mirror. But even as she put miles between herself and the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was just as unnerving. She glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see one of the figures sitting there. It was empty. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. When she finally reached the safety of her apartment, she locked every door and window, drawing the curtains tightly shut. But even then, she couldn't sleep. The next morning, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the inside of her front door, scratched into the wood, were the same jagged letters. "Leave." Celia's scream echoed through the empty apartment. And somewhere, in the distance, the whispers began again. Story 2. The antique mirror sat in the corner of Amanda's living room, its tarnished silver frame intricately carved with vines and roses. She had bought it on a whim at a flea market. Enchanted by its aged beauty, The vendor had sold it for a pittance, his smile nervous as he handed it over. "There's a story behind this piece," he had said, his voice low. "A tragic one. They say it reflects more than just your image." Amanda had laughed it off, dismissing the warning as an old man's attempt at drama. Now, days later, the mirror had become the centerpiece of her home, admired by visitors for its vintage charm. But something was off. It began subtly. At first, Amanda thought she was imagining it. She would catch glimpses of movement in the mirror's depths, shadows flickering where there shouldn't be any. Once she thought she saw a figure standing behind her, but when she turned, the room was empty. Her unease grew when she noticed that her reflection seemed delayed. She'd raise her hand, and the mirror would take an extra second to mimic the gesture. It was as though the image wasn't a reflection at all, but something else entirely, something pretending to be her. One night, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, the mirror caught her eye. Her reflection was sitting still, staring directly at her. Amanda froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She slowly raised her hand, waving it in front of her face. The reflection didn't move. "Okay, I'm just tired," she whispered to herself, forcing a laugh. She avoided looking at the mirror for the rest of the evening. But the incidents continued. She woke up one morning to find smudged handprints on the mirror's surface, small, childlike prints that didn't match her own. Another time, she swore she heard a faint tapping coming from inside the glass. Her breaking point came a week later. It was late, and the house was silent. Amanda was brushing her teeth in the bathroom when the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. She groaned, fumbling for her phone to use as a flashlight. The dim glow illuminated her face and the mirror behind her. Her reflection was smiling. Not a normal, pleasant smile. It was wide, too wide, the corners of her mouth stretching unnaturally. Her teeth were bared, her eyes gleaming with malice. Amanda stumbled back, dropping her phone. The room was plunged into darkness again, but she could feel the presence of something cold and malevolent. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The mirror responded. "You brought me here." The voice was hers, but distorted, warped like a recording played backward. Amanda's heart raced as she groped for the door, her hands shaking. She yanked it open and fled to the living room, slamming the bathroom door shut behind her. She couldn't stay in the house. Grabbing her car keys, she bolted out the front door, not bothering to lock it. She drove aimlessly for hours, her mind racing with questions. What was happening? What had she brought into her home? By the time she returned, it was nearly dawn. She crept back inside, the early light casting long shadows across the walls. The house was silent, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. She approached the mirror cautiously, her reflection staring back at her with the same wide, unnatural smile. "Get out of my house," Amanda hissed, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. The mirror didn't respond, but the smile grew wider. Then, to Amanda's horror, her reflection stepped out of the glass. It wasn't her, not exactly. The figure was taller, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its skin was pale and mottled, its eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. Amanda screamed, stumbling backward as the creature advanced. Its movements were jerky, inhuman, like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. "You brought me here," it said again, its voice echoing eerily. "And now, I'm staying." Amanda ran, her mind a blur of panic. She grabbed the heaviest object she could find, a cast iron lamp, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, the pieces raining down like shards of ice. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech, its form flickering like a dying light bulb. Then it was gone, the room falling silent once more. Amanda stood there, trembling, staring at the broken mirror. The oppressive feeling in the air had lifted, but she couldn't shake the fear that it wasn't over. She cleaned up the shattered glass and threw the frame into the trash, determined to rid herself of the cursed object. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. The faint tapping. It was coming from the bathroom. Her blood ran cold as she realized she had never looked behind the mirror. And now, she was too afraid to check. The tapping grew louder as Amanda sat frozen in her bed, clutching the sheets tightly around her trembling frame. It wasn't rhythmic. It wasn't a noise that could be explained away by the wind or a creaking pipe. It was deliberate, insistent, like someone or something was demanding her attention. Her heart pounded so loudly that she thought it might drown out the sound. but the tapping persisted, each knock scraping against her sanity. She didn't dare move. Her mind raced with the memory of that twisted creature stepping out of the mirror earlier. But the mirror was gone. She had shattered it, hadn't she? Then why was it still here? Amanda. Her name drifted through the air like a whisper, soft but clear enough to cut through the oppressive silence. It wasn't her voice, but it was close, too close. No, she whispered to herself, her voice shaky. This isn't happening. It's just in my head. But the tapping grew louder, more frantic. And now there was something else, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across glass. She couldn't take it anymore. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Amanda threw off the blankets and grabbed her phone. The small light from the screen illuminated the darkened room as she crept toward the bathroom. The door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. The sound was louder now, reverberating through her chest. Amanda! The voice came again, more urgent this time, and it sent a chill coursing down her spine. Her shaking hand pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges like a scream in the silence. The bathroom was empty, or so it seemed. She shone her phone's light around the room. The shattered mirror was gone, but the faint outline of where it had hung was still visible on the wall. Her eyes darted to the trash can where she had thrown the shards earlier. It was empty. What the... Before she could finish, the tapping returned. This time it was louder than ever, and it was coming from behind the wall where the mirror had been. Amanda's breath hitched as she took a step closer. She pressed her ear against the cold tile, her skin crawling as the tapping continued. It was right there, just on the other side. Then came the scratching again, long, slow drags of nails against glass. She staggered back, her phone slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. The darkness swallowed her, and for a moment, she thought she felt the air shift, like something was moving in the room with her. Amanda! The voice was right behind her now. She turned sharply, her back pressed against the wall. Her phone's dim light cast eerie shadows across the room, and her breathing grew shallow as her eyes scanned every corner. That's when she saw it. The mirror was back. It was cracked and warped, its frame blackened and twisted as if burned by fire. But it was unmistakably the same mirror she had destroyed. And staring back at her from its fractured surface was her reflection, or what was pretending to be her. The reflection's head tilted unnaturally, its grin stretching impossibly wide. Its eyes glowed faintly, filled with malice and hunger. "You can't get rid of me," it whispered, its voice a distorted echo of her own. Amanda stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the bathroom door shut. Her hands fumbled for her phone, and she frantically dialed the only person she could think of, her best friend, Chloe. The phone rang once, twice, and then... "Hello?" Chloe's groggy voice answered. "Chloe, you have to come over," Amanda said, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "It's the mirror, it's back. I don't know what to do." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Amanda," Chloe finally said, her voice strangely calm. "What mirror?" "The one I bought from the flea market," Amanda shouted, tears streaming down her face. "The one I told you about." Another pause. "Amanda, you've never told me about a mirror." Her heart sank as Chloe's words echoed in her mind. "No," Amanda whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible. I told you about it last week." "Amanda," Chloe said, her voice growing distant, "are you sure you're okay?" Before Amanda could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, her hands trembling. Her mind raced. Why didn't Chloe remember? Was the mirror erasing her memories? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash from the bathroom. She didn't want to look. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to leave the house and never return. But something kept her rooted in place, a morbid curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for answers. With shaking legs, she approached the bathroom door. She pushed it open slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The mirror was shattered again, its shards scattered across the floor. But in the center of the glass, something was moving. It was a hand. Long, skeletal fingers clawed their way out of the shards, pulling at the edges of the broken mirror. A face followed, pale, gaunt, and twisted with a malevolent grin. "You can't escape me," it hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "You brought me here, Amanda, and now, you're mine." Amanda screamed, stumbling back as the creature emerged fully from the glass. Its body was contorted and shadowy, its eyes burning with a sickly yellow light. She turned and ran, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in around her. The creature's laughter echoed in her ears, growing louder with every step she took. Amanda called, its voice mocking and cruel. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She reached the front door, her hands fumbling with the lock. Just as she flung the door open, the creature's hand grabbed her shoulder, its icy grip sending a jolt of pain through her body. She woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The room was silent. The mirror was gone. But on her bedside table, a single shard of glass gleamed in the moonlight. And etched into its surface was a single word: forever. Amanda sat up in her bed, trembling as she stared at the shard of glass. The word forever seemed to pulse faintly, as though it was alive. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, every muscle in her body frozen with fear. She wanted to throw the shard out of the window, to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't move. It felt like an invisible force was holding her in place. The silence around her was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The shard began to vibrate slightly, as if reacting to her panic. Amanda's fingers itched to pick it up, but she resisted, biting her lip hard enough to draw blood. A whisper crept into her ears, soft and teasing. "Amanda, you can't run from me." Her breath hitched. It wasn't coming from the shard this time. It was coming from inside the room. Slowly, she turned her head toward the corner of the room. At first, it was just shadows, dark shapes, blending into one another. But then she saw it. The outline of the creature's face emerged, its grin wider than she remembered, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It wasn't trapped in the mirror anymore. It was here. "You let me out," it said, its voice both playful and sinister. "And now, Amanda, I'll make sure you never forget me." Amanda scrambled off the bed, her back pressed against the wall. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice cracking. The creature's laugh was low and guttural, reverberating through the room. "Oh, Amanda," it said, taking a step closer. "Don't you see? I'm a part of you now." Tears streamed down her face as she groped blindly for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hand found the bedside lamp, and she hurled it at the creature with all her strength. The lamp shattered against the wall, plunging the room into complete darkness. But the glow of the creature's eyes remained. "You think you can fight me?" it whispered, its voice closer now. "You can't fight what's already inside you, Unsay." Amanda's knees gave out, and she collapsed to the floor. She could feel the creature's presence looming over her, its cold breath brushing against her skin. "Why me?" she sobbed. "What do you want from me?" The creature knelt down, its face inches from hers. "I want your fear," it said simply. "Your despair. Your soul." Amanda's mind raced. She couldn't let this thing win. She couldn't let it consume her. Summoning what little courage she had left, she grabbed the shard of glass from the bedside table and held it up between them. "You want me?" she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "Then take me." The creature hesitated, its grin faltering for the first time. The shard in Amanda's hand began to glow faintly, the word forever burning brighter and brighter. "What are you doing?" the creature hissed, its voice losing some of its confidence. Amanda didn't know what she was doing, but she didn't stop. She pressed the shard against her chest, the sharp edge biting into her skin. Pain shot through her, but she ignored it. "If you're a part of me," she said through gritted teeth, "then I'll take you with me." The creature let out a deafening scream, its form flickering like a dying flame. It reached for her, its claws inches from her face, but it was too late. The shard's light engulfed them both, blinding and searing. Amanda felt like she was falling, her body weightless and cold. The world around her dissolved into nothingness, and for a moment there was only silence. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her room. The shard was gone. The creature was gone. But something was different. The room felt wrong. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. She looked at her reflection in the window and froze. It wasn't her. The face staring back at her was twisted, its grin impossibly wide, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Amanda," the reflection whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "Forever." Story 3. It began with a single tap. Ellie had just moved into her new apartment, a quaint space in an older building nestled on the edge of the city. The rent was suspiciously cheap, but she chalked it up to her luck and the building's age. She was eager to start fresh, leaving behind the chaos of her last job and a breakup that had left her drained. Her first night there was quiet, almost too quiet. She unpacked her belongings, arranged her books on the shelves, and hung her favorite paintings on the faded beige walls. The apartment had its quirks, a persistent draft that seemed to come from nowhere, the occasional groan of the old pipes, but Eli found it charming. By midnight she was curled up on the couch, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone. That's when she heard it. Tap. It came from the wall behind her. A soft, deliberate sound like someone tapping their fingers against the plaster. Ellie froze, her mug halfway to her lips. She glanced at the wall but saw nothing unusual. Probably just the pipes, she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. But then it came again. Tap, tap. This time it was louder, more deliberate. Ellie set her mug down and stood up, her heart pounding. She pressed her ear to the wall, holding her breath. For a moment there was silence. And then, right next to her ear, tap. Ellie yelped and stumbled back, her heart racing. She stared at the wall, her mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe it was the neighbors. Yes, that had to be it. The building was old, and the walls were probably thin. But when she pressed her ear to the wall again, she didn't hear voices or movement. Just an unsettling, hollow silence. She shook her head, forcing a laugh. "I'm overthinking this," she said aloud, as much to herself as to the empty room. But as the night wore on, the tapping continued. It followed her from room to room, always coming from the wall nearest to her. When she brushed her teeth in the bathroom, it tapped against the tiles. When she climbed into bed, it came from the headboard. Ellie barely slept that night. The next morning, she called the landlord. "There's this noise," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "It sounds like tapping, coming from the walls. Do you know if there's anything wrong with the building?" The landlord, a gruff older man, sounded uninterested. "Old building," he said dismissively. "Probably the pipes. Nothing to worry about." Ellie hung up, unconvinced. The tapping didn't stop. By the third night it had grown more frequent and more insistent. Ellie tried to ignore it, blasting music through her headphones, but even that couldn't drown out the sound. She began to notice other things, too. The shadows in the apartment seemed off. They moved in ways that didn't match the light. Sometimes she'd catch something in the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement, but when she turned, there was nothing there. And then there were the whispers. They started faint, barely audible. Ellie thought she was imagining things at first, but as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder. They came from the walls, soft and low, like a voice speaking directly into her ear. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was cold, cruel, and filled with malice. On the fifth night, Ellie snapped. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty apartment. "What do you want from me?" The tapping stopped. For the first time in days, there was silence. Ellie's heart raced as she scanned the room, waiting for anything to happen. And then, from the far corner of the room, a voice whispered, clear and chilling, "We see you." Ellie spun around, her blood running cold. The corner was empty, but the shadows seemed to writhe, as if alive. She grabbed her phone and fled the apartment, her hands shaking as she dialed her best friend, Mia. "You have to come over," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong. I'm not safe here." Mia didn't ask questions. She arrived within 20 minutes, her face lined with concern. Ellie explained everything about the tapping, the whispers, the shadows, but Mia was skeptical. "It's an old building," she said. "You're probably just stressed. Maybe you're hearing things because you're not sleeping well." Ellie didn't argue. She was too exhausted. Mia agreed to stay the night, and for a while everything seemed fine. The apartment was quiet, almost unnervingly so. But at 3 a.m., Ellie woke to the sound of Mia screaming. She bolted out of bed and ran to the living room, where Mia was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "They're in the walls," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ellie, they're everywhere." Before Ellie could respond, the tapping started again. But this time it wasn't just one tap. It was dozens coming from every wall, every surface, all at once. The walls seemed to tremble, the sound growing louder and louder until it was deafening. And then, the shadows began to move. They poured out of the corners, pooling on the floor and rising like smoke. Eyes appeared in the darkness, dozens of them, all staring at Ellie and Mia. "We see you," the voices whispered, overlapping and echoing. "We've always seen you." Mia grabbed Ellie's arm. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice shaking. They ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows closed in, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. Ellie felt something cold brush against her skin, and she screamed, clawing at the door. Just when it felt like the shadows would swallow them whole, the tapping stopped. The room fell silent. Ellie and Mia turned to see the shadows retreating, melting back into the walls. The apartment was still, as if nothing had happened. Without a word, they grabbed their things and fled, leaving the apartment and everything in it behind. Ellie never went back. But sometimes, late at night, she still hears the tapping. The tapping followed her. At first, Ellie convinced herself it was all in her head. She was just traumatized, haunted by the events of that apartment. She had moved to a new city, far away from that cursed building, and rented a modern place on the top floor of a sleek high-rise. The walls here were solid, the neighbors quiet, and the air fresh. But the first night in her new home, she heard it again. Tap. Ellie froze, her fork hovering over her dinner plate. She strained her ears, praying it was the neighbor upstairs. Tap, tap. This time it was closer. Ellie's breath hitched as she stood up, her heart pounding. "No," she whispered to herself. "This can't be happening. Not here." She searched the apartment, every corner, every shadow, but found nothing out of place. The walls were clean and smooth, no signs of cracks or openings. She even knocked on the walls, testing for hollow spots, but there were none. The next day, she went to see a therapist. "I think I'm being followed," Ellie confessed, her voice trembling, "by something unnatural." The therapist, a middle-aged woman with a calming demeanor, listened patiently. "Trauma can do strange things to the mind," she said gently. "What you're experiencing could be a form of post-traumatic stress. You've been through a lot. It's not unusual for the mind to create patterns or sounds that aren't really there." Ellie wanted to believe her. She desperately wanted to believe it was all in her head. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. It followed her everywhere, on the subway, in her office, even when she walked through crowded streets. No one else seemed to notice it. Only Ellie. And then came the whispers. They started faint, just like before. But this time, Ellie could make out the words. "Run. Hide. Don't look back." The voices came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Ellie covered her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside her head, wrapping around her thoughts like a vice. She stopped sleeping, afraid of what might happen if she closed her eyes. Her reflection in the mirror became gaunt, her eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. Mia tried to help, calling Ellie every day, but even she couldn't ignore the changes. "Ellie, you need to see someone," Mia pleaded over the phone. "Someone who knows about things like this. Paranormal stuff." Ellie laughed bitterly. "What am I supposed to say? That I'm being haunted by shadows and whispers? They'll think I'm insane." But deep down, Ellie knew Mia was right. Desperate for answers, she visited a local psychic, a woman named Madame Serena. The woman's office was dimly lit, filled with the scent of burning sage and the flicker of candlelight. As soon as Ellie walked in, Madame Serena's expression darkened. "You carry something with you?" she said, her voice low. "Something ancient, something hungry." Ellie's heart sank. "What does it want?" Madame Serena shook her head. "It doesn't want. It consumes. It latches onto fear, feeds on your doubt and despair. It's not tied to a place, it's tied to you." Ellie's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. "How do I stop it?" The psychic hesitated, her gaze piercing. "You can't stop it, not entirely, but you can weaken it. You must face it. Acknowledge it. Deny it the fear it craves." That night, Ellie returned to her apartment, her resolve steeled. When the tapping started, she didn't run. When the whispers echoed through her mind, she didn't cover her ears. Instead, she stood in the center of her living room, her hands clenched into fists. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted, her voice shaking but firm. "You don't control me." For a moment, there was silence. And then the shadows came. They poured out of the walls like ink, swirling and writhing around her. The whispers became screams, a cacophony of rage and hatred. Ellie stood her ground, tears streaming down her face. "You can't have me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't take what I won't give." The shadows surged toward her, a tidal wave of darkness. Ellie braced herself, her heart pounding like a drum. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The shadows receded, the screams fading into nothing. The apartment was still, the air heavy with an eerie calm. Ellie collapsed to her knees, sobbing with relief. For the first time in weeks, the tapping was gone. But as she sat there, catching her breath, a single whisper echoed in her mind. "For now." Story 4. The train station was deserted, the kind of eerie silence that made every sound seem magnified. Clara pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, shivering as the wind sliced through the old, decaying building. It was the last train of the night, a slow, seldom used route that wound its way through the countryside. She had no choice. Her car had broken down miles from home, and her phone battery had died. The old man at the diner had told her about the train. "It runs late," he'd said, his voice gravelly. "Not many folks take it these days, but it'll get you where you need to go." Clara wasn't thrilled about taking a train she'd never heard of, but what other option did she have? As the train pulled into the station, its brakes squealing, Clara noticed how ancient it looked. The paint was peeling, and the windows were grimy, but it was her only way home. She climbed aboard, the door groaning as it slid open. The interior was dimly lit, the seats faded and worn. She moved to the middle of the car, choosing a spot near the window. There were only a handful of passengers, all of them sitting silently, their faces obscured by shadows. The train lurched forward, and Clara leaned back, trying to shake the unease settling in her stomach. She glanced at the other passengers, hoping for some reassurance, but no one met her gaze. An hour passed, the train winding through dark, empty fields. Clara's eyelids grew heavy, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels lulling her towards sleep. Just as she began to drift off, a low voice whispered, "You shouldn't have boarded." Her eyes snapped open. She turned her head sharply, scanning the car. No one was looking at her, and the passengers hadn't moved. "Who said that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Silence. Clara swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She told herself she must have imagined it. She was tired, stressed, that was all. But then the lights flickered. The train jolted, and for a moment she thought it might derail. When the lights steadied, Clara noticed something strange. The passengers were no longer in their seats. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the empty car. She stood, gripping the edge of her seat for balance. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. The only response was the groan of the train as it sped along the tracks. Panic began to set in. She moved toward the front of the car, hoping to find the conductor, but when she reached the door, it wouldn't budge. She slammed her fists against it, shouting for help, but no one answered. Behind her, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Clara turned, her heart hammering in her chest. At the far end of the car stood a figure. Its face was obscured, the shadowy light casting it in darkness. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward her, its steps unnaturally slow. Clara backed away, her hands scrambling for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a metal pole near the door, gripping it tightly. "Stay back," she shouted. The figure paused, tilting its head as if studying her. Then it whispered, its voice barely audible, "You don't belong here." The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, the figure was gone. Clara's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. She turned back to the door, pounding on it with all her strength. "Let me out." The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes deafening. Clara stumbled, nearly falling as the car jerked to a halt. She looked out the window, hoping to see a station, but there was nothing, just an endless stretch of barren fields shrouded in mist. The door to the car slid open with a hiss. Clara froze, her grip on the pole tightening. A man stepped inside, his clothes tattered and covered in dirt. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt. He looked at Clara, his expression unreadable. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I just need to get home," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Please." The man shook his head. "This train doesn't go home. It only takes what's lost." Before Clara could respond, the lights went out completely. The car was plunged into darkness, and Clara's screams echoed through the void. When the lights flickered back on, she was alone again. The train began to move, faster and faster, the sound of the wheels deafening. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. She had to get off, she had to find a way out. She moved to the nearest window, struggling to open it. It wouldn't budge. Desperation clawed at her as she threw herself against it, but the glass wouldn't break. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding her. "You don't belong. You shouldn't have come. Leave." The voices grew into a deafening roar, and Clara clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. And then, everything stopped. The train came to an abrupt halt, the lights dimming. Clara looked up, her breath hitching. The doors slid open, revealing a platform bathed in an unnatural, greenish light. The air was thick, suffocating. Clara stepped out, her legs trembling. The platform was empty, surrounded by an endless void. She turned back to the train, but it was gone. Clara stood there, alone in the nothingness, her mind reeling. And then she heard it. The sound of a train whistle, distant but growing louder. It was coming back. But this time she knew it wasn't coming to take her home. The whistle grew louder and louder, like a warning, but it was no use. Clara couldn't move. Fear had rooted her in place. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The platform seemed to stretch endlessly before her, and the darkness beyond it swallowed everything in sight. She forced herself to take a step forward, then another. The ground beneath her felt like it was shifting, like it was alive, and the air around her grew thick, suffocating. Her breath quickened. "Please, someone, help me," she shouted, though she knew no one would come. No one ever did. The train's whistle echoed through the emptiness, its sound now filled with menace. Clara turned around to face the tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. The greenish glow from the platform seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, casting shadows that twisted and writhed on their own. There, in the distance, it appeared. A train. The same one. The old, dilapidated thing. It hurtled toward her, its wheels screeching, the windows like dark eyes watching her. She could feel the cold air rushing in her direction, and the train's metallic screech grew sharper, almost unbearable. Clara stumbled backward, her fear almost choking her. The lights from the train flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to reach out toward her. But there was nowhere to go. It was closing in fast. In a desperate bid, Clara spun around and sprinted in the opposite direction, the sound of her own breathing the only thing she could hear, louder than the train now, drowning out everything else. Her feet felt heavy, the ground beneath her unsteady. The darkness seemed to mock her as she ran through it. Her foot caught something. She collapsed, the cold, sharp sting of the ground hitting her palms. When she looked up, she saw that she had fallen beside a small, rusted bench on the edge of the platform. It was covered in layers of dust and grime, like it had been forgotten for years, just like the train. A cold wind howled around her, and Clara pushed herself to her feet, but the train was nearly upon her. She had no time. There was only one choice left. With trembling hands, she grasped the edge of the bench, and using all her strength, tried to wrench it loose from the ground. But the metal was rusted beyond use, and it wouldn't budge. Tears filled her eyes as she turned back to face the train. She had no weapons. She had no way out. As the train's lights blazed before her, Clara's mind raced. What was happening? Why couldn't she escape? The train loomed closer, and in that moment she realized the terrifying truth. The train wasn't here to take her anywhere, it was here to keep her. Suddenly there was a deafening screech as the train came to a stop just inches from her. The door to the nearest car opened slowly, and Clara froze, unable to move, unable to think. Out stepped a figure, the same hollow-eyed man who had been on the train before. His clothes were even more torn now, his features even more gaunt. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried on the wind like an order. "You should have never gotten on," he said. "You can't leave now." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. It was too late. She was trapped. She had no choice but to get on the train. The man stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Clara's throat tightened as she looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She thought of home, of her family, of everything she'd lost. But she couldn't stay here in this endless nightmare. She had to fight. She had to make it out. With trembling hands, she turned and started running. She ran faster than she had ever run before, not caring about the fear that was trying to drag her back, not caring about the shadows that seemed to chase her. But as she looked back, the train wasn't there. It had vanished. The platform was empty, the tracks gone, replaced by an endless empty darkness. And as Clara stopped, panting and covered in sweat, she realized she wasn't free. Not yet. The train, the passengers, the whispers, they were all part of this place, this endless cycle, and she had just become a part of it. Story 5. It was an ordinary night in the quiet town of Ashford. The moon hung low, casting an eerie, pale light over the sleepy streets. A soft breeze rustled the trees, their bare branches creaking as if they were whispering secrets. In a modest house at the edge of town, Emma sat alone in her living room, flipping through a book, but barely reading the words. The house was still, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall and the occasional groan of the floorboards beneath her. Her husband, Mark, had been away for work, leaving Emma to spend the evening by herself. It wasn't unusual for him to be gone for days at a time, but something about the silence tonight felt heavier. She tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at her from the inside. The wind picked up outside, howling as it whipped against the windows. Emma looked up, her gaze momentarily caught by the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. The shadows outside seemed to stretch and twist, but she quickly turned her attention back to the book, trying to focus on anything that would distract her from the growing unease in her chest. Then, she heard it. A knock. At first, Emma thought it might be her mind playing tricks on her. The wind had been rattling the windows after all. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakable, the sound of someone knocking at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Mark was still hours away from returning, and she hadn't made plans to meet anyone tonight. Hesitantly, she set the book aside and stood up, her feet cold against the hardwood floor. The knock came once more, sharp and insistent. Who could it be? She approached the door slowly, each step making her more uneasy. She peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. The darkness outside was impenetrable, and she couldn't make out any shapes or figures. Confused, she pulled away and placed her hand on the doorknob, hesitating for a moment. Should she open it? It was too late for anyone to be making house calls. Another knock. Louder. Emma jumped, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She quickly unlocked the door, pulling it open just enough to peer outside. But there was no one there, just the darkness of the empty street stretching out in front of her. The silence was almost worse than the knocking. She stood there for a moment, her mind racing. Had she imagined it? Was there some sort of logical explanation? But then, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw something. A figure, standing at the edge of her yard, facing away from her. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, wearing a long, dark coat that blended into the night. It seemed to be waiting, its head tilted slightly as if listening. Emma felt her pulse quicken. Who was this? Why hadn't they come to the door? She called out, her voice shaky. "Hello? Can I help you?" The figure didn't respond. "Hey," she shouted again, more urgently this time. But there was still no answer. The figure stood motionless, as if it hadn't even heard her. She stepped back, about to close the door, when the figure turned slowly, its movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. It looked toward her, but its face was hidden in shadow. The only things she could make out were two dark, empty spaces where eyes should have been just deep, hollow blackness. Emma's heart raced as a cold chill spread through her body. She wanted to slam the door shut, but she couldn't move. The figure seemed to be drawing her in like it was calling her. Then it spoke. "Let me in." The voice was cold, hollow, and distant like it came from the depths of the earth. The words echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. The figure took a step forward, its feet gliding over the ground without making a sound. Another step, and then another. It was coming closer. Emma's instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from the door as possible, but her body wouldn't obey. She felt rooted to the spot, trapped in place by the figure's presence. It was like a dark force pulling her in. "Let me in," it repeated, its voice now more insistent, more demanding. A sudden surge of terror jolted Emma back into action. She slammed the door shut and bolted the lock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest, as if it were trying to escape her body. The house felt colder now. The warmth from the fireplace seemed to evaporate, leaving her with a chill that seeped deep into her bones. She stood still for a moment, trying to collect herself, but the silence was oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then she heard it again. A knock. A soft, almost imperceptible tap at the door. Emma's eyes widened in horror as she turned to face the sound. It was coming from the back of the house now, from the kitchen. Her mind raced. Was there another figure? How had it gotten around to the back so quickly? She backed into the living room, reaching for her phone, but it wasn't in her pocket. Panic surged through her as she scrambled through the room, searching for the phone. She found it on the couch, just as another knock echoed from the back door. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, her skin prickling with fear. Frantically, she dialed Mark's number, her hands shaking as the phone rang. But there was no answer. Of course there wouldn't be. He was still hours away. She cursed under her breath, feeling more isolated than ever. The knock at the back door came again. Louder this time, more forceful. And then, the voice. "Let me in." Then, the words came from the kitchen, just a few feet away from her. Emma froze, terror locking her in place. She didn't know what to do. The figure was here, somewhere in her house, and she couldn't escape. She could feel it drawing closer, its presence suffocating. She turned toward the kitchen, but all she could see was the dark doorway, an emptiness waiting for her. And then, something moved in the shadows. The door to the kitchen slowly creaked open. As the door to the kitchen creaked open, Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the very house itself was closing in around her. She couldn't see anything beyond the threshold, just an impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow up the light from the living room. The cold was suffocating, more intense than before. It was as if the figure's presence had frozen the air itself, making it hard to breathe. Emma's legs felt like lead, unable to move, yet her mind screamed at her to run. She should run. She should escape. But the figure's voice echoed in her mind once again, sending chills down her spine. "Let me in." It wasn't a request anymore. It was a command, a threat. The kitchen door, now wide open, beckoned her. Her eyes flicked back and forth, desperately searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the blackness. and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then, from the corner of the kitchen, something shifted. A shadow. It was the shape of a person, but it wasn't like any person Emma had ever seen. The figure stood still, unmoving at first, as if it were studying her, but it was the way it stood that terrified her. Its limbs were unnaturally long, twisted like the arms and legs of a spider. Its body was stretched beyond natural proportions, and the face Emma couldn't make it out fully. There were just those deep, empty sockets where eyes should have been, staring at her, pulling her in. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't look away. The figure took one step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, its feet making no sound on the floor. The movement was so unnatural, so wrong, that Emma's stomach twisted in knots. The figure stopped just outside the kitchen's threshold. It didn't move closer, it simply stood there, staring at her, as if waiting for her to make the first move. The silence between them was deafening, but Emma could hear her heartbeat thundering in her ears, drowning out everything else. "Why won't you let me in?" The figure's voice whispered, soft and haunting. It wasn't the same voice from before. It was something different, softer, almost coaxing, like a lullaby laced with venom. Emma's legs trembled, but she forced herself to step back, one foot at a time, never taking her eyes off the creature. She had to get away, had to escape, but where could she go? She was trapped. Without thinking, she reached for the phone in her hand, trying again to call Mark. It rang once, twice, and then the line went dead. The silence grew even more unbearable. The room felt as though it was closing in on her, suffocating her with every breath. She couldn't see the figure anymore, but she could feel it. It was still there, watching her. Emma turned to look toward the front door. She could make a run for it. She had to. But the moment she moved, she heard it. The whisper. "Don't run." The voice was no longer distant. It was right behind her. She whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. The door to the kitchen was now closed again, and yet Emma could still feel the figure, lurking just beyond the walls. It was toying with her, playing a game, and she was losing. She backed away toward the front door, her eyes darting around, searching for an escape. Her mind raced, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. How could she get out of here? What was it? What did it want? She reached the front door, her hand trembling as she grabbed the handle. She pulled, but it didn't budge. Locked. Her stomach dropped. She had locked the door before she'd sat down with her book earlier, but in her panic she had forgotten. The knock came again. Louder, more insistent this time. And then, that voice, so close now it was almost a whisper in her ear. "Let me in." Emma screamed. She didn't care anymore. She had to get out. She had to escape. Her heart was a drumbeat in her chest as she scrambled for the lock, fumbling with it. The door wouldn't open. She couldn't get it open. Then, behind her, the floorboards creaked. The kitchen door burst open, and the figure emerged from the darkness, its long, twisted limbs stretching unnaturally toward her. It was too close now. Too close for her to escape. But there was something else. Something in the air. A shift. The figure paused, its head tilting as if listening to something. Then, without warning, it turned and walked toward the back door, as if it had lost interest in her. Emma froze, watching as it moved toward the exit. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. Was it leaving? Was it going to let her go? She didn't wait to find out. She ran. She didn't care where, she just ran. Out the front door, down the steps, into the cold night. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, but she didn't stop. She kept running, her legs aching with every step, until she reached the end of the street. She stopped, gasping for breath, but all she could hear was silence. For a moment she dared to think she was safe, but then behind her, a soft laugh. The figure stood at the end of the street, watching her. And she knew, in that moment, that she would never be free.